We're up to Daf Yud Aleph Amid Beis, and we're up to the Mishnah, which is approximately 8 lines down, 10 lines down from the top. If you add a binyan to something that's mechuber l'karka, that's included on the Beleches Bona, and therefore you're not allowed to connect in a permanent way a deles, a door, to a binyan on Shabbos or Yontif. And the flip side of that is if you remove the door, then you're chayav from meleches soser. So now Mishnah deals with the case of Kalim. What is the status of Kalim as far as binyan and stira is concerned? Beit Shammai omrim, ein misalkim es hatrisim biyontif. Now we're going to learn soon that these trisim belong to a small, what we call here in Israel, a budka, a small hut, which is really not mechuber l'karka. It has the status of a keli, and nevertheless, Beit Shammai are of the opinion that this binyan b'kelin, and therefore, if you remove these doors from the closets, these portable houses, then that's something that's prohibited on Yontif. Beis Hillel matirim af lahachsa. Beis Hillel say that you're allowed to remove the door and you're allowed to replace the door. So the Gemara asks, "My trisim, what is the meaning of the word trisim here in the context of our Mishnah?" The Machlokas Beis Hillel Beit Shammai Ula Trise Chanuyos, and these are called tevos, which means they're little huts, so to speak, miniature huts that are situated out of the marketplace, and they are not connected to the karka. They therefore have the status of a kli. And this is where the store owners will set up shop out in the market, and they have these tevos which have windows, and they close it with trisim, with shades. And during the course of the day, when there are customers who are coming to see their merchandise, they open up the trisim so that the customers could see what they have to offer, what merchandise they're selling. And what they do with the trisim is they sort of stretch it out in front of the store, maybe on a table, and that's where they put the food on the trisim. So the trisim serve a double function. On the one hand, when it's time to close shop at night, they'll close the trisim. And on the other hand, when it's during the day, when it's open, they use the trisim as a kind of a platform or a table, and they place their merchandise on top of these trisim. Now, here's an interesting aspect of our Mishnah. Opening these stores on Yontif and selling the merchandise is perfectly acceptable. Now, you might ask, we don't buy things and use money and currency to purchase on Yontif or on Shabbos, but here they buy sort of like on credit, meaning the Baal Habayis, the Baal HaChanus, will put out his, let's say, spices, and the people, in order to spice their food on Yontif, will come and purchase, in quotation marks, spices. They won't pay for it with money. After Yontif, they'll pay for it, or maybe they paid up front. So our Mishnah quotes Beit Shammai that prohibit removing these trisim on Yontif, and they still allow you even to replace the trisim. Amar Ula, Shlosha Dvar Mitiru Sofan Mishum Tchilasan. Ula formulates a principle which is going to apply to explain Beis Hillel's ruling in our Mishnah. There are 3 cases, 3 dinim, which have the following lowest common denominator. Chazal would be matir something that normally would have been prohibited for the sake of tchilasam, meaning they realize that if you don't allow people towards the end of a process, heter, leniency and permissibility, then they wouldn't even start the process. And Chazal were very much interested in their starting the process, because that's l'tzorech yontif. Again, the principle is, says Ula, that if they won't be matir sofan, then people won't even begin chilas, and they'll be inhibited to start the process. Eluhain, here are the three cases that Ula fits in. We'll see Rachava is going to add a fourth case. Or lifnei adorsan. Now, what happens is after you slaughter an animal, which of course on Yontif we encourage for the sake of Simchas Yontif that he slaughter an animal, but what's he going to do with the R? Now, the R, the outer hides of the animal, has a certain market value, but you have to make sure that it's not left in its natural state for a long period of time, because then it starts spoiling. But what you can do is what's called the ibud, kind of a tanning process, and that's going to preserve the R. And are you on Yontif, after you shechted the animal, permitted to place the R, stretch it out in such a way that people will stomp on it, it's flat on the ground, and by doing so, they'll begin the process of ibud and prevent the loss of the value of the R. And the problem is that even though we're not excited about having people being dores and stomp on the R, because that's the beginning of the malach of ibud, of ma'abid, one of the 39 malachs, but nevertheless, if you don't allow them to do it, they'll be inhibited to shech the animal from the get-go, and then we're minimizing simchas yontif. Case number 2, Shrisei Chanuyos. When we allow the store owners not only to open their stores and remove the glossos, but also to replace the glossos. If you don't allow them to replace the glossos, they'll be very inhibited about opening their stores, because at the end of the day, when it's time to close shop at night, they'll want to, for security purposes, close the doors. So if we don't allow them, and this is the Shita Beis Hillel, to replace the doors, as we saw in our Mishnah, says Ula, they'll be inhibited from opening their stores. People will not have access to, for example, tavlinim, to spices that they need to enhance their kedera, their tavshil for yontif, and we're going to be minimizing simchas yontif. Case number 3, which really has nothing to do with yontif per se, and really has to do with a principle called ein shvus b'migdash. We'll explain. V'chazoras ritia. Ritia is what we call a tachboshes, otherwise known as a bandage. And in the migdash, when the Kohen has a makkah, he has some sort of an injury, and he needs to put a bandage around his injured arm, let's say, for example, then normally, if it wasn't because of the mitzvah of migdash, and we'll see how they were matir sofan mishum tchilasan, we would normally prohibit this. And the reason is because underneath the bandage, there is a gel, some sort of therapeutic cream, and we're afraid of meleches memachik, because what he's going to do is when he pushes the bandage down on his skin, he's going to inevitably smoothen out the cream or the oily ointment. However, we're going to put this chashash on the back burners. We're not going to be worried about the violation of the Yisur B'machek for the sake of migdash, meaning that the Kohen should be able to wear this bandage, and he should be able to remove it when he does the avodah, because otherwise it's chatzitza, separating his hand from the avodah. But we're going to allow him to replace the ritia after he finishes his avodah, because otherwise he's going to be too inhibited to start the avodah. He's going to have to take off the bandage, so there shouldn't be a chatzitza between his yad and his avodah, and he won't be able to replace the bandage. So we guarantee him that it's okay. Don't worry about it. You'll be able to replace the bandage. Rechava Amar B'Shem Rav Yehuda. Let's add a fourth case to this list of itiru sofa mishum tchilasan af haposeach chaviso umaschil beisoso al gav haregel. Now, in order to appreciate this Gemara of Rachava, we have to introduce a couple of principles by way of background. Principle number one is what's called Ochle Chulin B'Tahara. That means back in the time of the Talmud, many of the Chaverim who were dedicated to the Torah, the mitzvahs particularly, would avoid coming in contact with Tumah, even with regard to Chulin. I mean, if it's Hegdesh, then of course you're not allowed to be Mitame Hegdesh, but they wanted to eat all the Chulin B'Tahara. Principle number two is that your average run-of-the-mill person, that's called an Ama Aretz, he's not careful about Tumah, and we assume that wherever he is, he's Tameh. And if you combine those two principles, then you don't want a situation where an Ama Aretz is giving something over to the Talmud Chacham, to the Chaver, because then the Chaver might contract Tumah. However, the exception to this rule of assuming a chazaka that an Ama Aretz is Tameh is during the Regel. And we're going to see later on that this might be based on a pasuk. But we're going to go with another couple of approaches that during Regel, even the Ama Aretz has a cheskes tara, either because they're very careful during the Regel, they come on Aliyah Regel to Shalayim, so they put in that extra effort to be careful about tara, or more likely, since during the Regel there's going to be a lot of interaction, a lot of social intercourse between the Chaverim and the Ama Aretz, so the Chazal didn't want to embarrass the Ama Aretz in such a way that the Chaver would be marchik himself, stay far away from the Ama Aretz, and they gave the Amaratzim a cheskas tar. And exactly how the Chachamim have the authority to do so, that's a sugya unto itself, not for us today. Now, what happens is that during the course of the Regel, if let's say you're a chaver and you're selling food stuff, right? They have these outside, marketplaces to sell food during the Regel, and this is something that Chazal wanted to encourage. But the chaver who's selling is going to be inhibited about selling to an Ama Aretz unless we assume the Ama Aretz is tahar. And since the Chazal made this takana that during the Regel, the Ama Aretz has a cheskes tara, therefore he's allowed to sell, this chaver is allowed to sell ochlim during the Regel to all the Olei Regel, no matter who comes to buy from him, whether it's a chaver, whether it's an Ama Aretz. And even though they're all going to be memashmesh, be it deyem, but ena machalim nitmoim machmas maga omer. So again, when the Ama Aretz comes in to buy, we're not going to reject him, we're not going to refuse him, even though he's going to touch the food, and he might therefore, transfer tumah to the food. But no, we're going to assume the cheskes tar. And all this was done in order to facilitate this great chesed and mitzvah of being able to supply food for the Olei Regal. However, what happens in an event that the seller, who's been encouraged to sell, now has leftovers? Let's say, for example, he puts out barrels of wine, and he puts out loaves of bread, all for sale for the Olei Regal, but now it's no longer the Regal, and he's left with the leftovers. If they have a cheskas tumah, because the takana of tara, of cheskas tara from the Ama Aretz was only limited to the Regal, after the Regal there is no such takana. Now, if we're going to consider the machalim, like the chavis of yayin that we mentioned before, or the loaf of bread, as tameh, then that's going to inhibit the mochrim to sell up front. They know that there's a great chance, if not definite, that they'll be left with an oversupply of surplus, and then you're going to tell them that the takana doesn't apply and it's tameh. So no ser mehem liachar regel. And here we have a Mishnah in the Masechet Chagigah Chavav that records a machlokas tanoim. The Chachamim say that whatever is left over, you have to assume is tameh. And you cannot complete your process of selling because although the Ameoretz are tahorim, technically b'shas haregel, we don't really believe that they're tahorim, say the Chachamim, but rather during the regel we were machshav them to get tahorim. Again, the authority of the Chachamim have to do so. And beregel Ameoratzos the Chazal were mitayr the Ameoretz. And again, perhaps this is, as we mentioned before, possibly a reflection of the fact that a person has to be mitayr himself regel time before he goes to Yerushalayim, and maybe the Ameoretz were more careful about it. So that's fine. B'shas regel is no problem. We consider them as tahorim. We're not going to reject them. We're not going to embarrass them. But after the regel, that entire heter is no longer relevant. And now, let's say during the regel, they had come in contact with ochlim. We gave those examples of yayin and lechem. Then now, according to the Chacham, after the regel, l'mafreya, those ochlim are tmeim. And basically now, the mochrim, the sellers, are going to have to suffer that loss. Rabbi Yehuda says no. Yigmar. Yigmar means let them complete the process and sell the leftovers as well. We're not going to apply the principle of lemafreya, that which the Ameoretz came in contact with is tameh. From now on, Mikan Olabi has to be very careful that an Ameoretz won't touch them. But whatever happened during the regel, that does not in any way convey tumah. Comes along Rachava, and he says that this psak, this ruling of Rabbi Yehuda Lekula, who is mata ligmar to sell the vestiges and the surplus leftovers after the regel, that's based on hitiru sofan mishum tchila. So I'm going to allow you to finish the process of selling that you began, because otherwise you'll be too inhibited to begin the process. You won't want to suffer the hefsed, and then there won't be food available for the Olei Rig. Now, at this point, the Gemara is going to analyze the three cases of Ula, of Hitiru, Sofa Mishum Tchilasan. From the perspective of Pshita Mai Kamachon, what is Ula coming to be Mechadish? For example, case number one, that you're allowed to put the or, according to Basil, out, stretch it out, the hides, in order for people to stomp on the hides. The Gemara says, Tanina. We have this explicitly in a Mishnah. We have it right here. On Omid Aleph, Beis Hillel, Matirim, L'shtoach ha'or, L'drisa. So what did Ula add to us? And the Gemara says, Ma'od Tema. If not for Ula, you would have argued that Tamayu de Beis Hillel. Why did Beis Hillel matir shticha? Mishum dechazi lemizgal layu. Because forget about Ibud. He's not interested in Ibud. He's interested in sitting down on the or, using it as a seat, like a cushion, a mat. And that's Litzarch Yontif. The Afilu me Erev Yontif Nami, according to that logic, even if he had done the Shechita before Yontif, and he skinned and flayed the hides of the animal on Erev Yontif, we would allow him on Yontif itself to stretch out the or, because he's doing it not for the sake of Ibud, but rather Lemizkei Alayim. A mashmalon, that's what Ula is saying. No. the heter of Beis Hillel is not predicated on chazi lemizge alayim, but rather itiru sofa mishum chilosan. If they wouldn't allow him to stretch out the hides, then he's not going to shech the animal. He doesn't want to lose the value of the hides, which, as we said earlier, the hides spoil over the course of time, with the passage of time. And therefore, says Ula di Yontif in the Erev Yontif lo. If he had stripped the hides on Erev Yontif, then we're not going to allow him to stretch out the hides on Yontif, because anything that you could have done on Erev Yontif, you should do on Erev Yontif. And therefore, in this case of a behemoth shehufsheta b'erev Yontif, lo itiru Beis Hillel l'shtoach ora b'Yontif, sharei lo yimna, with an ayin, machmas kebi lishchot behemoth b'erev Yontif, lefi sheyochel l'shtoach ha'or mibodyo. He's got plenty of time in Erev Yontif. Let him check for Yontif, and he knows that it's Erev Yontif. He's allowed to stretch out the or. So the entire heter of Beis Hillel is not in a case where you checked it on Erev Yontif. In that case, we're not going to allow him to stretch out the or on Yontif, but rather on Yontif, if he shechted the animal on Yontif and then stripped its or, now we're going to allow him to l'shtoch oro, because if we don't allow him, then he won't bother. He won't be interested in shchit at all. He doesn't want to lose the value of his oros. What's unclear to me in this Gemara, by the way, is that the Gemara doesn't explain why is Ula justified in his understanding of Beis Hillel. Why not accept the original understanding of chazi lemizge alayim? And that question is going to pop up over and over again. Let's get to the second case of Ula's three cases. Trisei chanuyos. Nami Tanina. This also we have in our Mishnah. Beis Hillel matirim afla hachzir. Beis Hillel allow you not only to remove the trisim from these chanuyos, these portable stores, but also to put them back, to replace them. So what new din did Ula reveal to us? Call it itiru sofa mishum tchilasam. I don't need that. I have an explicit Mishnah that's matir. What did Ula add to my understanding of the Mishnah? Says the Gemara Mauda, I would have thought Tamayu de Beis Hillel mishum di'ein binya b'kelim. That Beis Hillel is of the opinion that there's no such thing as binya b'kelim, and therefore, when he puts the trisim back, he's not violating any isur. He ain't steer b'kelim, and when he takes off the trisim, and he's involved in a stira, but that's b'kelim. It's not mechubel l'karka. It's a kli. Therefore, v'afilu debatim nami. Let's say I have my own personal private closet in my house, and on Yontif, Beis Hillel would allow me to remove the doors and replace them because ain't binya b'kelim. Hamash Malon, no. Even if I hold ain't binya b'kelim, Beis Hillel would still prohibit taking off the doors and replacing them. Midrabanan, we're afraid that he might tighten the, knocking a nail to tighten the door to the closet, and that's already a binyan gomur that even if ain't binyan b'kelim, but in case of tokea, then it would constitute binyan. And also, we're afraid of a tirchi yisera. And Beis Hillel says that you're allowed to do this. Why? Because we're talking about chanuyos. And itiru sofa mitchil tchilasa. Chanuyos in the batim lo. So on a private basis, when we're not interested, there's no push of simchas yontif on behalf of the klal, you're in a private, then Beis Hillel's not going to allow you binyan b'kelim. Aim binyan b'kelim is correct on a doraisa level, but not midrabban. It's awesome. They were matir in the case of chanuyos because they wanted to encourage the public sale of food on Yontif to make sure that the food is accessible. People could come into the chanus, see all the stuff that's laid out. We're going to open the store and close the store. And all this mishum simchas Yontif itiru Sofa mishum tchilos. But in the house, where there's no push for the simchas, you might ask, well, the simchas yantav of a yachid, because he wants to get access to food, so then we'll tell the yachid to prepare the food and take it out of the closets before yont. Then we get to the third case. And again, I'm not sure, once again, as I indicated earlier, why and how Ula knows that they still are based on a itiru self-mitul tchilosan and not based on ein binyan u'kelub. This question is a little less pressing, because there are sources in the Gemara Masechet Shabbos that although ein binyan ustira v'kelub, but b'Rabbanan there is an iser of stira u'binyan v'kelub. Now we get to case number 3. Chazaras retia b'migdash nami tnina. We have a mission at the end of Eruvin, machzirin retia b'migdash. That in the Beis HaMikdash, we're going to allow the Kohen to replace the retia in the Migdash. Avalo b'medina. Outside the Migdash, we would not allow this, because as we said before, we're afraid of meleches mimareach. So what did Ula add to my knowledge of this Mishnah in Eruvin? Ma'odatem, if we only had the Mishnah Taima, what is the logic that underlies the heter of Chazaras Retia b'migdash? That's Mishum the Ein Shvus b'migdash. There's no Isa Shvus Mirabanan. The Shvusim are not noagim b'migdash, and therefore, if he wants to take off the bandage and put on the bandage again, it's only an Isa Shvus of Refuah, which itself is Gzeira Mishum Shchikas Samemonim. And if Ein Shvus b'migdash, Afilu going to Lav Bar Avodahu, which if you translate this literally, it's referring to a Kohen who's possibly Avodah, maybe he's a Balmum, and we're going to allow him to take off the Retia and put on the Retia because he's doing this in the environs of the Mikdash and Ein Shvus b'migdash. Hamash Malan, that's what Ula wants to teach us, that's not the reason for the heter, but he tiru sofa mishum tchilasan. If we don't allow him to put back the Retia, he's not going to take it off to begin with. And then he has a chatzisa problem, he's not going to do the avoda. So the bar avoda in, the la bar avoda lo. And Ula is telling me that if he's in la bar avoda, he's not fit, and he's not a candidate that's suitable for avoda, then we're not going to allow him to replace the Retia. Okay, now we get to the case of Rechavam. Poseach es chaviso, that he's allowed to complete the sale of the wine and the bread even after the regel. Nami Tanina, that also we have in a Mishnah in Chagiga. Poseach es chaviso, maskil bisoso al gav haregel. Is Rabbi Yehuda Omer Gomer, Chachamim lo yigma. So we see clearly Rabbi Yehuda allows you to complete the process of sale. You set up your whole kit and caboodle, and you bake your breads, and you put the wine in the chavis, you open the chavis to sell it, and now you're stuck with the vestiges. Rabbi Yehuda is going to allow you to sell it. Mao Ditem, I would have thought Tumas Amoritz Beregel Titara Shavyu Rabbanon. And based on a pasuk, we could derive the conclusion that the Amei Aratzim are Tahorim in an absolute sense during the regel. And this is based on a pasuk in Shoftim, Perek Chav, Vayosef Kol Ish Yisrael Eloir Ki Ish Echad Chaverim, that during the time of Asifa, which is the time of the regel, all the Chaverim are Becheskes Tara. And if that be the case, then v'afal gavlo histil nami, even in a case where the Amoretz came in contact with the food stuff during the regel, and now he wants to sell that food stuff after the regel, he hasn't even started preparing the sale. He's not going to suffer any financial loss, but nevertheless it should be mutter. Why? Because there's an absolute rule, an assumption that the Ameoritz are Tahorim during Regel. Mashmalon, that's the Chiddush here of Rechava, that in truth, even Rabbi Yehuda agrees that the Ameoritz are not Pecheskes Tara during the Regel. They made a special takana, but after the Regel, whatever they came in contact with is Tomei L'Mafreya. But yet, Rabbi Yehuda was matir to continue the sale because of Itiru Sofa Mishum Tchilos, and if they won't be matir to continue the sale, then he doesn't want to open up his merchant, sell his merchandise on the Regel, and therefore the people will be left without ample food during the Regel. Hiskil in lo, hiskil lo. But if he hasn't begun to sell during the Regel, he didn't already prepare that process with regard to these ochlin, then we're not going to allow him, even Rabbi Yehuda would not allow him to complete. Why didn't Ula add this fourth case of Poseach Chaviso Beregel, according to Rabbi Yehuda? Ula did not want to get into a machlok between the Chacham Rabbi Yehuda. The Chacham didn't allow it. So the Gemara asked, "But hanafnami plutayu minu." Let's take, for example, the case of or shtichas or lifnei adursan, and for that matter, tritzei chanuyos. All this is a machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, and Beit Shammai said it was awesome. And if you're telling me beplugta loka mairi, then Ula couldn't have enumerated these cases of or lifnei adarsan and tritzei chanuyos. And Gemara answers, Beit Shammai b'makom Beis Hillel eino mishnah. That's not considered bepluta kamairi if you're accepting the shita Beis Hillel and rejecting the shita of Beit Shammai. Now we learned in the Mishnah that there's a double machlokus between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel. Number one, with regard to Hachsaras Trisim Limkomo, and number two, even with regard to Hasarasa Mitchila to take off these doors, these trisim, the shutters. So the Gemara now quotes a different opinion. Masnisin Deloki Haitana. The Mishnah does not reflect the sheet of the following Tana. The Sanya, we have a Beitza. Omer Rab Shimon ben Elazar. Modim Beit Shammai Beis Hillel shemesalkin es hatrisim biyontiv. Even Beit Shammai concede that you're allowed to remove these trisim on yontiv. Lo nechugel lahachsish. Beit Shammai omrim ein machzirin. Ubeis Hillel omrim af machzirin. So we see that according to this Beitza of Rab Shimon ben Elazar, Beit Shammai on matir, they permit hasaras trisim. That's against our Mishnah. The Beitza continues. When do we have such a machlokes? That's b'sheyesh lem tzir. That these glossos of the tevos have kind of like handles both on the top and on the bottom. And what they do is they drill holes in the walls, the tfanos of the teva, and they create kind of like tzirim, hinges, on the glossos like they do in their house, in the doors of their house. And therefore, in a case of yesh lahem tzirim, there's a tzir on top and a tzir on bottom. We have a beautiful diagram here. Then it's very similar to binyan, and that's when Beit Shammai prohibited. Aval ein lahem tzir, if they don't have these hinges that attach the door, or shall we say the shutter, to the window, then Divrei HaKol, even Beit Shammai would agree, mutter, you're allowed to replace them on Yontiv, because it's not similar to binyan at all. Why? Because they don't have tzir. So the Gemara immediately asks the question, for Asanya, we have a Beitza with regard to Machlokas Beis Hillel Beit Shammai Bedvar B'murim B'Shein Lem Tzir. Aval Yesh Lem Tzir, Divrei HaKol also. The transmission of the Beitza is completely opposite that of our Mishnah, of the first Beitza. Because according to this second version, the Machlokas Beis Hillel Beit Shammai refers to the case of Ein Lahem Tzir. That's why Beis Hillel were matir. But Yesh Lahem Tzir, even Beis Hillel would aser it, whereas the previous prices said exactly the opposite, that if it's Ein Tzir, everybody agrees it's mutter, and if there's a Tzir, there's a machlok. Somewhere Abaye says you can reconcile this apparent contradiction between the two brisos. When there's a tzir on the dlosos of the bottom, on the tzad, which is again a classic kind of a hinge on the side, Divrei HaKol, both Beis Hillel and even Beit Shammai agree also. According to Beit Shammai, because yesh binyan u'stira b'kelim, and that's a doraisa. According to Beis Hillel, it's also b'rabbanon, because once yesh lahem tzir min hatzad, then it's similar to meleches boneh. But ein lahem tzir kol ikar. If you just simply replace the shutters and they are sort of caught in the frame of the delis, but there is no tzir, is divrei hakol mutter. Everybody agrees that this is not similar at all to binyan. There is no tzir that attaches the tris to the side of the chanus, and therefore even Beis Shammai would agree that it's mutter in the case of ein lahem tzir, and that means it's mutter both hasara and hafzara. Ki pligi, in what case the Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai argue b'sheyesh lahem tzir b'emtza. There are no yadios b'rasheim, meaning on the top and on the bottom, but rather there's something that sticks out on the side, and that's ba'emtza, and that's where they attach in that, they drill a hole and they attach in the middle of the dofen of the opening to the teva so that the delis won't move, but that's not similar to binyan at all. Mar Sovar Beit Shammai hold that in this case of tzir ba'emtza, even though there's no Isur Doraisa, but Gazrinon, Tzir B'emtza to Tzir Min Hatzad, if we allow him to remove and to replace the trisim in a case of Tzir B'emtza, that he's going to do so, even in a case of Tzir Min Hatzad, and then he's going to violate an Isur Doraisa binyan and stira, Marsa Beis Hillel lo Gazrinon. We assume that a person will understand very well that only if it's a tzir by emsa, then it's mutter, but not a tzir min hatzad. We don't have to worry that it'll come to violate a tzir min hatzad. And here, Rashi adds another point, and that is that even in the worst case scenario, if it would be a tzir, then according to Beis Hillel, it's possible that he would not violate a doraisa. And therefore, to prohibit a tzir by emsa, when even a tzir min hatzad is not also midoraisa, only beside gzeira, that we're not going to do. So just to summarize, here on the top of Yud Beis, we see that we can clarify these two brisos. The Tana of the first brisa who said, "Bamed v'larum kishiyesh lahem tzir, aval ein lahem tzir divrei hakol mutter," he's talking about a case where there's a machlokes from Beis Hillel Beit Shammai and a tzir ba'emtza, and that's called Yesh Lahem Tzir in the language of the first brisa. But if Ein Lahem Tzir klal, even Beit Shammai would matir. If there's a Tzir min hatzad, then everyone would agree, even Beis Hillel, that it's asur. And the Tana of the second brisa who writes Bamed dvar amurim b'shei Ein Lahem Tzir, aval Yesh Lahem Tzir divrei hakol asur. That means he's referring to a machlokes in ein lahem tzir min hatzad, aval yesh lahem tzir ba'emtza. And on that, he made the statement, aval yesh lahem tzir min hatzad, even Beis Hillel asks it, if there's no tzir at all, then he would certainly agree that everybody, as a universal principle, would be matir, and therefore there's no stira between the two brisos. Each one is teaching me a different din, and both brises agree that the machlokes Beis Hillel Beit Shammai is only in the case of tzir ba'emtza.